In the queer turn in feminism, I expressed some dismay at the way in which the rejection of biology, a commonplace of Western feminist discourse, looked less and less like an argument and more like a quasi-automatic rhetorical move, functioning like an authorizing device destined to grant access into the precincts of feminist theory. I wasn't the first one by far to express such concerns. If anything, I came late in a long and eclectic string of feminist thinkers that comprised mainly feminist scientists, historians of science, or epistemologists. Donna Haraway and her groundbreaking essays collected in Simian, Cyborg, and Women come to mind, but also more and more feminist theorists coming out of the humanities. Elizabeth Wilson is one of them, a queer feminist theorist based in the US who strives to reconcile biology and feminism. She has recently traced back in a book entitled Gut Feminism what she calls the anti-biologism of both feminist and queer theory to the seminal work of Gail Rubin in the mid-70s. One of the first and most forceful proponents of gender theory in a feminist perspective, Rubin laid the theoretical ground for the heated debates pitting social constructionism against biological essentialism in the next decade. The sex-gender system theorized by Rubin in The Traffic in Women is predicated on the nature-culture divide inherited from Lévi-Strauss, who himself traced it back to Rousseau's own distinction between nature and society in the discourse on the origins of inequality. As Lévi-Strauss himself reminded his readers many times, the oppositional and temporal disjunction between nature and culture played a decisive role in the formation of human and social sciences, allowing them to carve out their own epistemological space and to designate culture in its broadest sense as their proper object and field of inquiry. In Gut Feminism, Wilson shows, through a close analysis of Rubin's wording and grammar, how the feminist anthropologist's characterization of the nature-culture divide aims at widening the gap between them to the point of casting biological systems and cultural systems as, she says, autonomous, each operating according to its own internal logic, end quote, without one giving any clue about the other. Moreover, whereas nature is not at all coterminous with biology in Rousseau's heuristic positioning of a state of nature prior to the advent of society, just as bios in Aristotelian Greek is not the same, not only as zoe, but also as physis, it is Rubin who performs the conflation between nature and biology by repeatedly characterizing the presumed naturality of sex as opposed to the social or cultural constructedness of gender as biological. Thus, she famously defined the sex-gender system as, I quote, the set of arrangements by which a society transforms biological sexuality into products of human activity, end quote. And she used the same formula to commend psychoanalysis' effort to explain, I quote again, the transformation of the biological sexuality of individuals as they are enculturated, end quote. Whereas Wilson wants to argue that there is nothing raw in biological processes in that they are neither immutable nor immune to their social as well as physical environment, Rubin's notion of biological sexuality as raw material, that's Rubin's formula, or passive substrates, that's Wilson's formula, preempts such a conceptual move. Now, Rubin's sex-gender system has been widely criticized starting from the early 90s, when feminist theory took a deconstructive and Foucauldian turn, coterminous with its queer turn. Faulting the oppositional and binary structure of the sex-gender system and questioning the logical and chronological anteriority of nature over culture, which seemed to condone the idea that there was indeed something like a natural nature prior to culture and a purely biological body prior to its disciplining by culture, Butler, in particular, proposed to read sex, sexuality, and the sexual binary as effects of culture and its apparatuses. Yet, the idea that sex, biology, and nature belong to the same side of things, that is, the side opposite to gender, culture, and history, has continued to endure. Harry's warning against the partly misconceived anti-naturalism of the nascent feminist theory at the end of the 80s was an attempt to answer this particular conceptual and discursive conundrum as it gained currency in the 80s. And while what one might have expected her to call on Rubin, as Wilson did much later, she ascribed this short-sighted anti-biologism not to Rubin, but to de Beauvoir. In her, and that's also in Simeon Cyborgs and Women. In her famous chapter on the données de la biologie, literally the data or givens of biology, Beauvoir describes the human female as constitutionally, that is biologically, alienated from herself because, contrary to her male counterpart, she is bound to and by the species due to her role in the reproduction process. If one is not born a woman, women are unfortunately born female. This biological given, donné, need not prevent women from becoming free subjects, but as a given or fact of life, it can only be overcome if women manage to rise above the vicissitudes of their sexed body, for instance, by avoiding motherhood, or more precisely, pregnancy. Beauvoir, as we know again, sums up the problem in a well-known and striking formula, I quote, "Woman is her body as man is his, but her body is something other than her." Now, Beauvoir herself signals in a footnote that this statement, which she had already made in a simpler form a few pages earlier, is derived from Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception. It is Merleau-Ponty who coined that formula without seeming to make any ontophenomenological distinction whatsoever between men and women or females and males, although his use of the first person, je suis donc mon corps, literally, therefore I am my body, suggests that his comprehension of the body, based as it is on a phenomenological grasp, hence a subjective experience of the matter, might well be contingently, if not paradigmatically, masculine. For this assertion, Merleau-Ponty was seeking to counter the Western age-long tradition of metaphysical dualism. Je suis donc, therefore I am, is both a philosophical and literal inversion of the Cartesian donc je suis. I think donc je suis, therefore I am. By substituting the verb to be for the much more conventional and widespread verbs to have or to own, as in I have a body or I own my body, the philosopher challenged the prevailing Cartesian idea that one has a body separate from oneself, which one possesses, as one could or should, according to Descartes, possess nature, and that one can therefore dispose of by rising above it, for instance, through the act of thinking. To say, I have a body, is to perform discursively an ontological separation between subject, the I who utters the sentence, and object, their body or my body. To say, I am my body, is to affirm the phenomenological identity or coextensiveness between I and my body. In Merleau-Ponty's view, there is no going beyond one's body. Embodiment is the condition, indeed the phenomenological dimension of subjectivity. When, however, Beauvoir rewrites Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological formula by turning the first person statement, je suis donc mon corps, I am, therefore I am my body, into a third person one, l'homme ou la femme est son corps, man or woman is her or his body, she folds phenomenology back into classical ontology, thus changing the meaning and scope of Merleau-Ponty's utterance. Moreover, in placing the statement in the context of her reflections on the physiological body, that is, the allegedly natural body, Beauvoir radically alters its signification. It cannot be understood anymore as an anti-dualist statement. What Rubin's and Beauvoir's arguments show then is that anti-biologism, to use again Wilson's characterization, might not only be an understandable and defensive reaction against the misogynistic reduction of women to their procreating bodies, but also a sign and effect of Western feminist thought's continued entanglement with Western metaphysical dualism, in spite of its often stated desire to free itself from it. In my opinion, Rubin's, and to a lesser extent Beauvoir's, mischaracterization of sexuality as biological before it is enculturated, and therefore of biology as innately sexual, a notion that Rubin herself has thoroughly abandoned in Thinking Sex, which testifies to her own queer turn, theoretically speaking, of course, has played a role in the frequent misreading throughout the 80s of a number of feminist thinkers who worked with psychoanalysis in the 70s or relied on a Freudian or neo-Freudian understanding of the sexual body. For psychoanalysis, the body, meaning the human body, is, to use Beauvoir's own characterization at the onset of her chapter on psychoanalysis in The Second Sex, a corps vécu par le sujet, a lived-in body, a body experienced by the subject, quite close in this sense to the body of phenomenology. And this corps vécu, lived-in body, which Freud scans and deciphers according to the interpretive paradigm of sexuality, has little to do with the physiological body, at least the one biologists and physicians purport to study. If, according to psychoanalysis, sexuality infuses the body, if it puts bodies in touch with themselves, as it were, through autoerotic exploration, and if it brings them together under the spell of desire, it is not because of the biological imperative of reproduction. As some of his most acute readers from within the field of psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan and Jean Laplanche, have emphasized, albeit in quite different ways, Freud's unrelenting effort has been to systematically and rigorously distinguish the realm of sexuality from what he calls, in a restricted way, the sexual function. Sexuality as such, we might say, is non-functional, if not dysfunctional. It doesn't obey the phylogenetic program of the species reproduction, which also means that it manifests itself singularly in each and everybody according to each singular history. If bodies can be trained and disciplined to act and feel in similar ways, this is precisely the result of social experience. When Freud theorized the existence of erogenous zones and discovered that these zones can concern any part of the body and that they differ from one individual to the next, he read them as the mnemonic traces of the caresses or blows received in infancy and early childhood, as the inscription then on the body's excitable surface of the subject's historical experience. The Freudian sexual body, in this sense, is not the generic body specified only by physiological sexuation Beauvoir talks about in the chapter she devotes to biological data. Moreover, being as it is molded by experience, it is not given as such at birth and by birth. It isn't, in that sense, a natural body. Remember that the word nature, quite different, as I was saying, from the notion of physis, also in that respect, literally means what is native, what comes and comes only at and with birth, from the Latin word nascior natus sum, which means to be born. In a recent interview published in the British journal Parallax, I have played with this linguistic genealogy and have proposed to read the so-called natural body as a kind of dead body, a body given before anything happens, before history, before life, before life starts being lived and experienced, a still life of sorts. This was not an idle game with a dead etymology on my part, since the association of nature with pure beginnings and unscathed origin continues to be active in philosophy as well as in ordinary thinking. Now, to go back to my initial statement, if I did formulate in the queer turn of feminism a regret that, Beauvoir notwithstanding, little effort had been made by feminist thinkers and scholars trained in the social sciences and the humanities, myself included, to engage seriously with the thinking and knowledge deployed in the life sciences, the gist of my argument then had more to do with the misunderstandings arising from the conflation effected by a certain and early kind of feminist theory between the body, nature, and biology. Because this line of thought has cast the body as a fixed and natural given, it has tended to do precisely what it accused essentialist thinking of doing. Turning its back to the allegedly natural body, it has missed out until recently on the transforming perspectives opened by psychoanalysis and phenomenology, as well as on the more recent developments in the burgeoning field of neurosciences. I agree then with Wilson's assessment of the shortcomings and inner contradictions of feminist anti-biologism. But Wilson's purpose is indeed to pursue a biological line of inquiry with seriousness and proper intellectual equipment. Mine is not. In fact, I now worry about what I see as an equally ill-thought biological turn in the human and social sciences in general, and in the field of feminist or post-feminist gender studies in particular. And this is what, so this was a kind of false start. And this is what I'm going to talk about a bit more lengthily today. The reasons for this biological turn are manifold and can be inferred from the body of works I will consider shortly, namely Catherine Malabou's Changing Difference, first published in French in 2008, and The New Wounded, first published in French in 2015, Wilson's Gut Feminism, published in 2013, and Beatrice Paul Preciado's, I use both names because when he published Testo Junkie, he still identified as a she. Beatrice Paul Preciado's Testo Junkie, first published in 2008. There is a reactive component in that turn, typical of intellectual life cycles, the alleged reign of discursive analysis for the past 30 years or so, and the ban on a body talk deemed essentialist, having now produced a somewhat begrudging retour de balancier, so kind of boomerang effect, as explained, for instance, in the introduction to the recent anthology, not so recent by now, compiled by Diana Kuhl and Samantha Frost under the heading of New Materialisms. But this is only part of the explanation. Let me now take a look at some of the works that seem to me to exemplify that turn, albeit in vastly different ways, in order to find clues to this epistemological, intellectual, and cultural shift. Changing Difference was Malabou's first attempt to bridge the gap between philosophy and the life sciences, a task she had undertaken several years earlier, from a feminist perspective. In that book, the philosopher casts her reappraisal of biology and biological sciences as a gesture that might eventually render women's habitation of and recognition by philosophy possible. These are her words. She has a chapter in that book on the topic called Possibility of Woman, Impossibility of Philosophy. The book clearly has a personal stake. It reads as a declaration of independence from her former master Derrida, and as a feminist affirmation of her ability to trace her own path as a woman philosopher. In her subsequent work, Malabou seems to have found a vindication of the move she started performing in What Should We Do With Our Brain, which was first published in 2004, and then Changing Difference, within the more specific field of neurosciences. She has become a relentless proponent of the alliance between philosophy and neurosciences, and a firm believer in the ability of brain studies to shed, if not a definitive light, at least a more powerful one, on questions that have occupied philosophy and literature forever, and more recently, for some of them at least, psychoanalysis, such as the twin questions of desire and love, of time and memory, but also of historical becoming and politics. We are living at the hour of neuronal liberation, she thus claimed with unrestrained enthusiasm in her introduction to What Should We Do with Our Brain? In The New Wounded, From Neurosis to Brain Damage, and the second edition appeared in French in 2017, the feverish optimism with which Malabou hailed the advent of a new epoch of knowledge and power has given rise to an almost chastising exhortation addressed to all human sciences to jump on board of contemporary neurosciences. I quote her, and this is my translation because actually the preface to the second edition, I think, hasn't been published in English. So I quote, "Psychoanalysis, philosophy, all of human sciences must welcome the brain as a newcomer in theory. They must make space for its materiality as well as its shape, both of which account for its strangeness as well as its critical import," end quote. Note the imperious tonality of the statement, reinforced by the repetition of the verb must. This epistemological imperative takes on an almost moral quality and is echoed throughout the book by similar formulas, such as page 25 in the English edition, which decrees psychoanalysis' definitive supersession and spells out clearly the ambition and stakes of the book. I quote, "Today, the etiological value of sexuality has been subordinated to that of cerebrality, thereby reversing the old hierarchy." The French actually says, "renversant l'ordre ancien de la domination," overthrowing the old order of domination. End of the parenthesis. That, I continue with the quote, "that until quite recently privileged psychoanalysis. Subordination of sexuality should be understood to mean, first, the effacement of the specificity of the sexual within the affects governed by the emotional activity of the brain," end quote. Aggravating the imperative rhetoric I have so far drawn attention to, Malabou deploys the whole semantic range of domination and power with verbs and nouns like subordinate, govern, in French, commander, old hierarchy, in French, ordre ancien de la domination, and privilege, in French, prééminence. In so doing, she turns the epistemological debate into a political scene, even a raging battlefield. The New Wounded's ambition, as one can infer from the previous quotes, is indeed to give the lie and the final blow to Freud's theory of trauma, and beyond that, to his theory of sexuality, which Malabou accurately links to the former. More radically, Malabou purports not only to overthrow Freud's supposedly reigning theory of trauma, renverser l'ordre ancien de la domination, but to do away with the paradigm of sexuality altogether in order to install cerebrality in its place. The phrase subordination of sexuality and its immediate explication as the effacement of the specificity of the sexual proclaims what it means to perform. The effacement of the specificity of the sexual can only lead to the demise of sexuality's explanatory power. I will come back later to the means and meaning of such an endeavor. If Elizabeth Wilson, like Malabou, also wants feminist theory to engage more closely and less suspiciously with what Wilson herself calls biological data, she nonetheless questions the wholesale embrace of neuroscientific discourse by what she calls, aiming, I believe, specifically at Malabou, I quote, "the new breed of neurologically informed critics." In her introduction to gut feminism, she warns, I quote, "where traditionally many feminists have preemptively dismissed biological claims, the new breed of neurologically informed critics want to swallow biological claims whole," end quote. Wilson, I quote again, rejects the creed that biological data bring interpretative methodologies to an end, end quote. In other words, that the new findings on the nature and function of the brain hail not only the end of the conceptual reign of sexuality, but also the twilight of the humanities and human sciences, to begin with psychoanalysis, as interpretative methodologies, a suggestion made time and again by Malabou. Finally, Wilson worries that the centrality granted to the brain by neurosciences and its new converts reproduces and biologizes the traditional privileging of the head with its attending view of the living organism as a hierarchical structure composed of a commander-in-chief and its obeying bodily members. And as you know, chief is the old word for head, at least in French, from the Latin caput capitis, which is also the stem for words such as captain or capital. Now, this common picture of the workings of the body, at once metaphysical and metaphorical, too often translates into a conventional and conservative view of the so-called political body. My goal, Wilson writes, to counter this tendency, I quote, is to draw in the periphery of the body as psychological substrate and de-isolate brain from body, psyche from chemical, neuron from world. Hence her choice of the gut as a strategic location for probing the intersection between biology and feminism. Wilson tries to articulate a notion of biology that is dynamic, that's her word, and as, I quote, as wayward as any social, textual, cultural, affective, economic, historical, or philosophical arrangement, end quote. Moreover, gut feminism has two specific goals whose connection the essayist attempts to foster throughout the book. On the one hand, she's interested in the biology of depression and what its current pharmaceutical treatment teaches us about the nature of this psychosomatic ailment and the complex action of neuronal transmitters. On the other hand, she wants to think about what she calls the hostility, bile, she puts this between brackets, intrinsic to feminist politics. The examples she gives of hostile feminist behavior, from angry outbursts to shrewd discursive maneuvers, make it clear that the hostility she's most concerned with is the one that feminists, if not feminism itself, direct at themselves and each other. As we know all too well, a lot of feminist theoretical efforts have been directed at debunking fellow feminists' misconceptions. I'm no exception. In Wilson's view, this kind of self-aggression, if this is an accurate view of these border wars, is reminiscent of, or perhaps akin to, the mechanisms at work in depression. Depression, Freud tells us, is a form of aggression turned back inward. Against the view held by many psychiatrists and neuroscientists that psychoanalysis is pure baseless speculation, Wilson actually works hard at reconciling Freud and Prozac, psyche, and soma. Gut feminism is full of thought-provoking suggestions, and its attempt to radically undermine the distinction between the organic and the psychic while refusing to turn biology into the new coercive epistemic power is compelling. I also find myself in agreement with her remarks on the unacknowledged and all the more virulent hostility at work in the tendency to extol the superiority and redemptive character of anti-normative stances, be they feminist or queer, a tendency which often translates into moralistic chastising under the guise of political righteousness. Yet, the connection between feminist hostility and the biology of depression is more postulated than it is demonstrated, and the gain or payoff, to use Wilson's economistic vocabulary, of a biopsychomolecular approach to feminist hostility, or more broadly to feminist analysis, remains unclear to me. The content of the book partly belies its title. It is indeed about a non-brain-centered exploration of something like a biological unconscious. That's a notion she uses, she borrows from Ferenczi, another psychoanalyst and disciple of Freud. It is about a refusal to continue to treat biology as the abject object of feminist theory. But is it really about feminism? What is the political import of the book? In my opinion, one finds a more forceful, albeit disturbing, articulation between biology and queer or post-feminist politics in the work of Beatrice Paul Preciado. In Gut Feminism, biological and feminist claims are linked to what Wilson calls, in a somewhat odd formula, pharmaceutical claims. And Wilson has smart things to say in the wake of Derrida's seminal analysis of the workings of the pharmacon on the pharmaconistic aporias of the clinic of depression, as well as on the treatment of its own hostility or quasi-depressive anger by feminism. But nowhere is the pharmacological turn of contemporary biology and its political stakes made clearer than in the work of Preciado. Testo Junkie by Preciado is about the transgressive, uncontrolled, and unregulated ingestion of testosterone, a hormone involved in the rather spectacular development of a number of masculine biological markers or secondary sexual characters. Hyperandrogyny can be manufactured, as is the case in protocols for so-called sexual transitioning that rely on the massive production of synthetic hormones or the reproduction of natural hormones by the pharmaceutical industry. Or it can occur naturally, as is the case in the biology deemed pathological because it is outside the statistical norm of some forms of what one calls today intersexuality or intersexualism. Hormones spontaneously produced by the body and hormones marketed by the pharmaceutical industry, whether natural or synthetic, have the same potential to upset the sexual binary. There is, in this sense, no ontological difference between the naturally produced testosterone and the manufactured one, or between original and supplement. And even though, as a feminist neuroscientist remarked to me some time ago, the biochemical effects of a regulated intake of hormones might be different from those stemming from the natural variations of hormone levels in our bodies, the ones that occur all the time and naturally, one could say that hormone production occurring naturally is already plastic, to use Malabou's language. The hormones manufactured by the body are always already, or virtually, a pharmacological tool ready to be used as a technique of gendering. As a matter of fact, the very first gender theory in the Western world, that is, the theory of the non-coincidence between gender and sex, was coined by an endocrinologist, John Money, a specialist of hormonal dysfunction in children. Hormone administration plays a major role today in both the real manufacturing of sexual transition and the cultural representation of the trans body. Two readings of the trans body are therefore possible. Two arguments can be and have been made on its behalf. The still more common one, based on the nature-culture dichotomy I was discussing earlier, is that the trans body, as a thoroughly constructed body, embodies the overcoming of nature by culture and its techniques, thus accomplishing, willingly or unknowingly, the Cartesian program of subjection and mastery of the natural realm. The other one, which the works of Malabou and Wilson are both striving to articulate, is that the trans body belies the notion that biology belongs to the realm of fixed essences. It shows that biology is potentially transformative, always already potentially transformative, that there is indeed nothing natural that is given once and for all about the biological body, that there is, in short, no ontological and therefore no epistemological break between biology and pharmacy. Preciado's aim in Testo Junkie, though, and his or her characterization of biology as pharmacy are more directly political than either Malabou's or Wilson's. Pursuing the line of inquiry opened by Michel Foucault, he wants to show, in practice as well as in theory, that contemporary biopolitics is not simply anymore about disciplining bodies from the outside, as it were, but about manufacturing them from within in the service of an all-encompassing capitalist economy. Now, as I said before, when Priscilla wrote that book, he still identified as a female lesbian, and the book actually plays with the different levels, if I may, of adequation between the author's persona and the narrative voice. And so that's why I've chosen to keep the pronoun she, referring not to the author, but to the narrative voice. So now I close the parenthesis. Under the new pharmacopornographical social regime, Priscilla writes, I quote, "The technologies become part of the body. They dissolve into it, becoming somatechnics. As a result, the body-power relationship becomes tautological. Technopolitics takes on the form of the body and is incorporated. One of the first signs of the transformation of the somatopower regime in the mid-20th century was the electrification, digitalization, and molecularization of these devices for the control and production of sexual difference and sexual identities," end quote. One of the major consequences of this technologically driven intensification of biopolitics is that it becomes very difficult to conceive of the body, either the Foucauldian hedonistic body that cultivates pleasures, or the sexual body that defies prohibitions of second-wave feminism, as a possible locus and means of resistance to the grip of power. In an extraordinary section of the second chapter of Testo Junkie entitled Potentia Gaudendi, the power to enjoy, the power of enjoyment, rather, Priscilla describes the way in which, under the pharmacopornographic regime, it becomes impossible to distinguish the human power to enjoy, potentia gaudendi, from the capitalistic drive. Hence, the apparently wild, untamable sexual energy of the body, a close kin to the Freudian libido, from the technically engineered and profit-oriented process of commodification, not only of the world, but of life itself in all its aspects. If for Marx, the worker's body was already the living basis for the conversion of the labor force, potentia laborendi, into capital, the orgasmic force of the molecularized bioengineered sexual body tends to blend with the flow of capital itself. Erectile swelling and capital growth partake in the same logic and movement, so that all jouissance and each orgasm conquer to the swallowing of life by biocapitalism. Each creative act, down to the writing of Testo Junkie, feeds on the insatiable, destructive, auto-cannibalistic drive of capitalism. Priscilla's reinterpretation of Marx, a reinterpretation that is both a departure from and a revival of the latter's thesis, not unlike Foucault's own relation to Marx and Marxism, deserves a much more thorough examination than I am able to offer at the moment. Let me just say that Priscilla illustrates or even embodies and theorizes the disquieting complicity of the biomedicalization of contemporary subjectivity and sexuality, sexuality being a conduit of subjectivation and a central component of subjectivity, according to both Freud and Foucault, albeit on different accounts, with global nano-molecular capitalism. Let me now go back to the question of the gains for thinking, remaking the world in general, and for a feminist epistemology and politics in particular, of the biological turn I have so far described. In his handling of T, the acronym Priscilla uses throughout her book for testosterone, Priscilla comes close to assert that gender and sexuality have or can have a biomedical, hence a biological basis of sorts. Take Priscilla's descriptions time and again of the effects of testosterone ingestion on her mood and behavior in the first chapter entitled Your Death. In the first chapter entitled Your Death, he describes the first effects on her hymn, let's say on her, of testosterone intake in the following terms. I quote, "Then an extraordinary lucidity settles in gradually, accompanied by an explosion of the desire to fuck, walk, go out everywhere in the city. This is the climax in which the spiritual force of the testosterone mixing with my blood takes to the fore," end quote. It is as if way before it had perceptible effects on secondary sexual characteristics such as voice alteration or beard growing, the testosterone supplementation affected her erotic relation to the world, thus testifying to the biochemical dimension of sexuality. He is seized by an explosive desire to fuck, to walk, to go out, all impulses that are culturally associated with masculinity. The city, which he feels like crisscrossing thoroughly, the French says, traverser tout entière, becomes a female body that one might possess by going and coming through it. The strength or force of testosterone, however, is described as a spiritual force, a qualification that can be read in two contradictory ways. On the one hand, it might be taken in Wilsonian fashion as a confirmation that the spiritual force of testosterone is no metaphysical manifestation, but a pure and real physical effect of biopharmacology, that the spiritual then is a matter of physiology. On the other hand, it can be read as a clue that what is presented here as a biochemical effect is in fact a story of psychic and psychosomatic possession by the ghost of GD, the acronym for Guillaume Dustan, whose spirit looms over Priscilla's impulse to take testosterone and write Testo Junkie. Remember that the first chapter is entitled Your Death and addressed to GD, Guillaume Dustan, who was himself a French gay writer and pornophile, and who had just died from AIDS. The testosterone intake in this sense can be interpreted as a gesture of melancholic incorporation, hence as a tentative resuscitation through reincarnation of GD's dead body, turning the hormonal supplement into something akin to a magic potion rather than a biopharmaceutical supplementation. Further along in the book, though, when in the chapter entitled Jimmy and Me, Jimmy is the nickname she gives to her dildo, when Priscilla chronicles his sex life and love story with Vidi, the acronym for Virginie Despentes, he suggests again a direct connection, this time between hormonal makeup and moods, and moods or feelings. I quote, 4 days go by without my giving myself a dose of testogel. When she, VD, rejects me, I feel a rise in estrogen and realize that I could cry at any moment, but I hold back to keep seeming like an idiot in love. Under my skin, the monster of the female cultural program is awakening. My body has been trained to produce the affects of a woman, suffer like a woman, love like a woman. Testosterone isn't enough to modify the sensory filter. Fuck Beauvoir, fuck feminism, fuck love. To avoid sinking into an ordinary episode of female masochism, amplified by a rise in estrogen, I force myself into the strict discipline of a program of virile coaching, end quote. Believing her or himself to be rejected by Vidi, the narrator feels despondent and wants to cry. While he defines the state he is as a monstrous effect of the female cultural program, she, or let's say simply she in this instance, nonetheless attributes the surge of tears to a lack or sudden decrease of testosterone. At the beginning of the paragraph, he had indicated indeed in an apparently matter-of-fact way that she had stopped taking testosterone for 4 days in a row. Might the level of estrogen or testosterone in one's blood be enough if not to determine, at least to trigger such gender-connotated behaviors as crying or conversely fucking? Does estrogen make women out of females? If that is the case, one might, as she says, one might as well, as she says, fuck pouvoir and send feminism packing. In the following paragraph, though, Priscilla doesn't seem to attribute a biological cause to ordinary feminine masochism, but she does suggest that the latter is amplified by a rise in estrogenic production. Certainly, other and equally numerous passages of Testo Junkie, maybe less numerous, seem to go against this biological or biomedical reading of sexuality and gender, as when he forcefully asserts that, I quote, and this is something that's in the French text, but somehow hasn't been translated in the English translation, the little passage that has been skipped. So I quote with my translation. I am what I am, and I don't need the medical body to grant me the permission to be a man more than I ever have been. That's an ambiguous statement anyway. In similar fashion, in the sexual autobiography, he sketches out in chapter 5 the claim that, I quote, since childhood, she had a fantastical or phantasmatical construction worker's cock, and I quote again, reacts to every piece of ass that moves, end quote, suggests that one doesn't need to have recourse to biological supplementation to feel and act like a man in the twin registers of gender and sexuality. Fantasy is as powerful a substitute or remedy for the lack of proper material equipment. What are we to make of the claims that are nonetheless made against Lacan, if not against Freud, and certainly against mainstream feminist theory, that gender and sexuality have or can have a biomedical basis? Are these instances of writerly irony, meaning we shouldn't take Priscilla's statements at face value, but then when do we know to take her or him seriously? Or is this a case of tragic irony, that is biological irony? Perhaps both. At the very least, these claims are a sign of the at once social and epistemological pressure exerted by the biological turn, a turn that is all the more powerful as it is driven by the profit-oriented logic of capitalism, as Priscilla, her himself, playfully shows. If biomedical advances have such a persuasive force, isn't it indeed because they are spearheaded by capitalist interests, indeed take the shape of capitalist ventures? A number of scholars in the social and human sciences have recently started to reflect on the stakes of the current biomedicalization of sexuality, a biomedicalization which is coterminous with the shift from a psychoanalytic to a neuroscientific paradigm I started to describe earlier. Isabelle Dusauge, a gender studies scholar who specializes in the analysis of techno-scientific discourses and procedures, has analyzed the nature of the experiments conducted by neuroscientists interested in the workings of desire and sexuality in a piece called Sex, Cash, and Neuro Models of Desire. Most, if not all, brain exploration conducted in order to find out not only what women want, that was first question, but what people want, is done through MRI imaging techniques, which are supposed to provide irrefutable empirical evidence for the conclusions drawn. Dusauge shows that what she calls the framing, both discursive and technical, of these experiments heavily influenced the findings that result from them. The nature of these experiments, for instance, showing supposedly exciting pictures to the participants already when they are in the machine, in the tube, already implies a theory of the circuits and nature of sexuality that remains both implicit and unquestioned. The disconnection of these experiments from any social context contributes to an understanding of sexuality that collapses the distinction between physiological arousal and yearning, between an instrument of satisfaction and an object of desire, or between perception of external stimuli and fantasy, the latter involving complex scenarios whereby ghost stimuli are resuscitated in narrative form. Moreover, the confining shape of the apparatus, the MRI tomb-like tube, mirrors and thereby reinforces the basic notion that, I quote Dusauge, the brain contains all the answers one is looking for. In other words, that, I quote again, it works as an enclosed material world, reaching out to the world in an inside to the outside movement, end quote. Intersubjectivity and relationality, so central to both psychoanalysis and social sciences, remain literally out of the picture, the MRI picture. Dusauge is particularly interested in the techno-economistic rationality that underlies the search for clues into the mechanisms of desire and that pervades the analytic language of scientific researchers. Okay. Yes, sexuality, is understood by them, at least by the group of scientists, neuroscientists she has studied, and described through the vocabulary of reward, gratification, and expected return. The anticipation of pleasure is conceived on the model of the anticipation of benefit. This is one more suggestion that the neuroscience of sexuality is a science for our time, namely the time of the all-out search for profit, of the virtual turning of bodies themselves into capital resources or investments. By contrast, Freud's and Lacan's notion of desire is bound up with the idea that it cannot, and in some ways does not seek to be satisfied. Furthermore, psychoanalysis is an attempt to understand the singularity of each subject's desire or desires according to the vicissitudes and contextual particularities of her or his history. Freud was initially trained as a neurophysician, as we know, and he often appealed not so much to the biological knowledge of his time, but to a biology yet to come as a potential help for solving some of the lingering mysteries of the human makeup and behavior. Yet, in the same way as he doubted that the biology of reproduction could teach us anything about gender difference, Geschlecht, he didn't think that the empirical study of neuronal circuitry was enough to account for the psyche, or perhaps better, the psychic body. As he states at the end of his famous conference on femininity, I quote, "If you want to know more about femininity, inquire from your own experiences of life, or turn to poets, or wait until science can give you deeper and more coherent information," end quote. True, neuroscience was hardly developed in his time, and techniques of imaging capable of following in real time the activity of the brain did not exist. Neuroscientists today are, for the most part, faulting Freud and psychoanalytic theory for being too speculative, prone to fiction. The Freudian body, though speaking in all kinds of manner, and possibly because of that, cannot really be mapped out by the usual methods and instruments of hard science. Hence, science's distrust, if not sometimes contempt of it. No anatomical drawings, no techniques of exploration of the inner body, such as the ones so heavily relied on by contemporary neurosciences, could ever render visible the workings of the libido and the drives, or the processes of repression and sublimation. All notions that Freud invented or rather re-elaborated in order to try and account not only for the circuits of emotion, but also for the psychosomatic traces of experience, not only for the ways in which the pressures of sexual excitation affect the brain, or rather affect the body through brain activity, but also for the ways in which the social pressures of frustration mobilize or even produce the psyche as such. The psyche, itself a mythological antonomazist psyche, is not the brain. Does it mean that the Freudian body is a theoretical fiction? Or more exactly, does it mean that fiction is of no use for our understanding of and living in the world and our body? and I'm nearing the end, don't worry. One can find elements for the beginning of an answer to this question in Malabou's own revocation and partial invalidation of Freud. To Malabou's credit, her presentation of Freud's theory of the libido, as well as of the psychoanalytical notion of psychic event in The New Wounded, is remarkable, a sign that she is knowingly dealing with a formidable adversary. But since my time is up, I will only sketch the lines of a future development on the topic. One of the key words Malabou uses time and again to pinpoint Freud's straying and his mistaken focus on sexuality is the word détour, détour in French, détour. I quote, "The sexual is the detour of the cerebral," she writes in apodictic fashion in the section of the book that bears the title, "The Neurological Subordination of Sexuality." And a few paragraphs below, I quote, "The cerebral economy of emotions does not require," now the English says the diversion, but the French says détour, détour, "the detour of psychic energy and the constitution of an apparatus whose imaginary topology would superimpose itself, in some sense, upon the anatomical and biological organization of the nervous system." In a subsection entitled Cerebral Autoaffection, she states again, I quote, "Psychic energy is, in a certain sense, the rhetorical detour of nervous energy," end quote. What is a detour? A detour, the dictionary tells us, is a sinuous path, one that leads us away from a direct line to the projected or assumed goal. A detour is a deviation, then, which puts us at risk of losing our way, hence of straying, and that involves a potential loss of time as well as energy. As such, it entails a temporal as well as a spatial deferment or deferral of the aim, if any. Both the sexual and the psychic energy, or let's say the sexual as psychic energy in the Freudian sense, are characterized by Malabou as detours, meaning they are literally deviant or devious. They lose and spend themselves or their subject on the way. As either an actual economy or as the theoretical modelization of that economy, psychic economy is not economical, hence perhaps also not profitable as a theory, contrary to the cerebral economy, which makes no detour and therefore yields higher epistemological benefits. To sustain his view of psychic energy, Freud is thus obliged to deploy extra energy and to give an additional and imaginary twist or turn, in French rhetorical parlance, a tour, to its biological and anatomical foundation, building on top of it an imaginary apparatus, a paper tower, une tour of sorts. Literally, a detour is indeed, and first of all, a tour, an additional and peculiar twist or turn given to the course of things, le cours des choses. But do we not always experience the course of things as a turn of things, le tour que prennent les choses? Isn't the cours des choses always already a tour des choses? Rhetoric being the art of tours and detours, of turns and tropes, the detour can be said to be a form of applied rhetoric. Conversely, the recourse to the metalinguistic metaphor of rhetoric, hence to rhetoric per se, constitutes a detour. The characterization of the detour as rhetorical, in my third quote of Malabou, is almost in this sense redundant. Against both the gist of her argument and the tendency of nervous or neuronal energy, whose pathways being without detours are straightforward, toward economical energy saving, Malabou stays or strays with the metaphorical flow and continues, I quote again, "Not able to discharge itself within the nervous system, endogenous excitation is diverted, détourné, into roundabout paths, into turns, tours in French, comparable to tropes or figures of discourse. The unconscious is structured like a language only to the extent that the brain does not speak," end quote. 2 pages later, she adds in the same vein, the sexual drive is, in a sense, reducible to the afflux of energy that presses forth and knocks at the door, demanding to be liquidated. But this liquidation is never simple or immediate. It subjects energy to detours, scissions, and divisions in order to, now the English says, unfortunately, transform, but in French it's translate, traduire, in order to translate it into the ciphered message of représentance. Sexuality is the hermeneutic adventure of psychic energy, end quote. Endogenous excitation, another name for sexual energy, is diverted into roundabout paths, in French, voué au dévoiement, dedicated to detour, whose tropological nature and operation, turns or tours, comparable to tropes, Malabou correctly identifies. The path from Freud's libido to Lacan's unconscious becomes clear. Both are structured as a language. In the next passage, she describes the sexual drive as an energy that wants to be spent, but whose spending is neither simple nor immediate, because that energy is prone to tours, that is detours, that divide and turn it, as it were, into cryptic, that is psychic, messages, begging, or psychological, if you want, begging to be deciphered. This turning out of sexual energy and turning out and into something like a secret language is presented accurately as an operation of translation, albeit a costly one, and is deemed adventurous. If I understand correctly Malabou's reproach to Freud, she doesn't fault him so much for making sexuality speak, but for making it speak rhetorically, through costly detours that constitute the psyche as such and get us lost in translation. While we are engaged in the deciphering of this topology, we lose sight of the straightforward messages emitted by the brain. Is it possible to speak without detours, that is, without straying, without fictionalizing, in a less adventurous, tentative, and speculative way? Is it possible to live without detours, that is, without deviating from our presumed, or for that matter, certain biological course? Aren't we always lost in some kind of translation? Freud defined life in irreducibly ambiguous fashion as a detour toward death, meaning that we are always simultaneously heading toward it and straying away from it, so that psychic qua-sexual energy is indeed spent, but not liquidated, not right away. And as soon as one engages in that sinuous path, full of tricks and turns, a path psychoanalysis has endeavored to map out figuratively, and literature as an art of tours and detours has been treading and threading for a long time, don't we need interpretative methodologies of some kind as much as we need imaging technologies? Would a life without detours be worth the tour? And that's it.
Thank you, Anne. That was wonderful. I'm going to open the floor, the screen, to questions. And remember, if you could please use the raise hand function so I can manage, because I can't see everybody. Are there hands up? I don't see it. I can't. Elizabeth, I can, your hand is up.
Yeah, I finally figured out how to do it. I always forget.
Okay.
Where is Anne?
She's, well, I don't know.
No, I have to find her. Wait a minute. There you are. Oh, that was fabulous. That was just absolutely wonderful, and particularly your reading of Malabou. I mean, when I first read her, I I couldn't believe what she was saying. I mean, it's as if the entire effort of maybe 25, 30 years to undo metaphysics is totally forgotten. And it's not, I mean, not just by her, but it's shocking when it's by her, but by everybody else with their turn to the material and so forth. And so the, I mean, what's so striking and what you showed so beautifully is that the object of knowledge is always something that we should be able to know. I mean, we should be able to pin it down, which of course is exactly what cannot happen with sexuality. And what's also striking is that Freud's understanding of sexuality as, you know, the sexual drive as being on the frontier of the body and the psyche is never, it doesn't seem to have ever been understood. So I think it's interesting. Elizabeth Rudinesco says somewhere that it's in her interview with Derrida, where she says that where Freud's effort to undo metaphysics was his effort to develop the metapsychological, and the metapsychological directly refers to metaphysics. It's an alternative to metaphysics. So, but it's also what you brought up, and I'm not sure I have a question, but just these comments you brought up. The relationship of the refusal of metaphysics to capitalism is very interesting, it seems to me. So I was wondering, maybe that is a question. Capitalism plays with metaphysics in sort of sneaky ways, right? The commodity is a sneaky turn on the metaphysics. Is that what makes, I mean, is that what explains this enthusiastic return to the material, this enthusiastic embrace of the metaphysical, and its conjunction with capitalism?
It's a vast question, and being a little tired by my virtual performance, I don't know if I can answer. I mean, I have tried. First of all, of course, I've tried to show that, you know, what I call this kind of new biological turn is a turn to the biomedical, you know, to hence also the importance of the pharmacological paradigm. And of course, the pharmacy is intimately bound up, not only with technology, but indeed with capitalism. I mean, with the industry, with the pharmaceutical industry. So I do try to, and you could say, you know, I think again, this is not exactly my field, but here again, the kind of enthusiasm for, you know, the MRI technology, which of course has, as we know, served useful medical purposes, but is being used, at least by a number of, you know, the neuroscientists as the la voie royale. I mean, you know, the royal path for Freud for the understanding of what he called sexuality and the psyche was, as he said, literature, but for neuroscientists, it's indeed, you know, the MRI tube, something like that.
No, I mean, and you explained that very well. And but what I'm asking is, what about the critical thinker who cannot see past that enthusiasm?
That's right. It's very striking, you know, to,
yeah.
I mean, certainly in Malabou, this kind of, you know, deification, you know, of, and hence also this language of proselytizer language, you know, come to the neurosciences, you who have strayed, you know, in the fields of literature, the humanities, philosophy, psychoanalysis, etc. Now, about you said something which I think is true, but which would you know, which would deserve some more development, which is to say, because it sounds, you know, if one doesn't explain it, counterintuitive or paradoxical, you conflated the kind of new materialist stance with some kind of metaphysical stance, and in a way, and I think you're right in the sense that, or more exactly, in the sense that if we take as a definition of metaphysics what Derrida suggested, which is the putting in place or the putting back in place of, you know, massive oppositions like you know, the opposition between psyche and the brain, or the opposition between you know, the material, the real material, so to speak, as opposed to the speculative materiality of Freud's erogenous body, etc. But of course, we're not, I mean, you know, when Freud speaks about the erogenous zones, etc., he's speaking of, you know, material experienced effects in the body. I mean, sexual excitation is felt in the body, but it cannot be accounted for. I mean, the complex ways in which psyche and body, in which the body is psychicized, so to speak, or the psyche is embodied, is indeed, you know, what Malabou says is that, you know, let's replace sexuality by cerebrality, and let's make sure that the first and last word goes to the brain, you know, and again, the brain is not the psyche. So this kind of approach involves dropping, you know, you have the people who haven't understood yet what, you know, neurosciences, what brain studies are telling us, are giving us, etc. You'd better drop, you know, this whole this paradigm of sexuality, which is far too speculative. Now, what I want to suggest also, I mean, and this is just an oblique hint in this paper, is that there is a connection between this kind of discourse and indeed the attack on humanities, and also, I would say, more broadly, the cultural demise, for instance, of literature. You know, it's the idea that it's again, it's in new garb, and maybe not. It may not be a return in this sense of you know, a time-old attack on fiction, you know, and fiction as straying, as not being the path for any, you know, valuable truth or whatever. So, you know, here we have indeed all metaphysical motifs, you know, springing back. And one thing I don't talk about in this paper, but which has struck me and which to me is part of the same thing, is the way in which, you know, a certain notion of trauma is being used now, not by, you know, trauma theorists informed by psychoanalysts or whatever. So I'm not thinking of Kathy Caruth or people like this, but for instance, the notion of trauma that underlies all the business that's going on in the States around trigger warning, etc. The idea, you know, that there is, that you can, and which relies on the notion of trauma, which is indeed, you know, a biophysiological reaction, you know, to an external trigger, etc. All this, and which is as we know, being used and has effects in the way we think, for instance, of teaching. All this to me, and this is what I want to talk about, if not show in my book, all this is related.
Oh, that's wonderful. Hurry up and write your book.
I'm looking for raised hands. Well, can I maybe
Please.
follow up on something that, in Elizabeth's comments, she began with the kind of new assertion of an object of knowledge, which is outside the process of knowledge, and which is one form this kind of new materialism takes. And I mean, one thing, of course, that is absolutely central to Freud is that sexuality or desire, of course, is completely inseparable from knowledge and vice versa, right? I mean, so desire is a form of knowing or wanting to know. And
but it's the same thing, yes.
So that said, I'm wondering where you would place Foucault in all of this, and in particular the whole notion of biopolitics, which has obviously, the concept has become extremely important again, but it is, undergone a certain kind of evolution. I'm thinking particularly how it has filtered through Agamben, and I guess also someone like Roberto Esposito. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering where you would place that in the kind of landscape that you are laying out. And the reason why I thought about this is because of what Elizabeth also said in her comments, which is the connection between capitalism and the return to the metaphysical. Elizabeth, am I understanding that? Yeah, okay. Because of what biopolitics was doing, at least under with Foucault, is in fact linking the operation of knowledge to power and domination, etc. Which, by the way, in terms of your reading of Malibu, was really incredibly interesting. How the tropes that she uses.
It's a good and vast question. Of course, well, first of all. In a way, Foucault's work is seminal. First of all, because he provided, the basic vocabulary to think of what we now call, as you say, the concept has vastly enriched and gone in different directions. Biopolitics. I think, and you see, but of course, I think that what Malabou does, for instance, could very, if Foucault was alive, he could fold up the kind of, her endeavor into, he could give a, how do you say that in suite? I mean, a continuation to what he started doing in the history of sexuality. And I'm sure he would, there is everything in Foucault that could help us understand precisely how, under which, material, social, technical, economical conditions, a certain biological discourse is rising to the position of epistemic power, I think, yes, and Foucault is certainly, I mean, and at the same time, you see the premises within a certain complicated, actually, turn within Foucault, a certain designation of the body as the locus, of these operations of power and knowledge, already are an anticipation of what we see today, which is what I've called, I'm not the only one, of course, the biomedicalization of sexuality. What Foucault, of course, couldn't foresee was that the biomedicalization of sexuality is the demise, or what I call the end of sexuality. In a certain way, you could say that Foucault is both on the way. I mean, he both opens, the path toward the end of this paradigm in a certain way, I would say, and at the same time, he gives us a number of tools to think about it, because it's exactly what you say, it's one understands how one discourse at a certain point, becomes, in Malabou, it's very clear, the new knowledge is the new power. The new power is the new knowledge,
Yeah. Nicolas.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Anne, for this wonderful presentation. I just wanted to follow up on this Foucault question and to ask you your take on this debate on biopolitics and governmentality, on this rupture from societies of discipline to societies of control, and the role of neuroscience in all of this. I was recently just watching this clip of Zizek, discussing surveillance societies, and he's saying, I'm not as afraid of that as neurological interventions, the commodification of neurological waves, let's just say. So I just wanted to ask you about this topic.
This is, and of course there is a whole new, also not new, but there is a whole post-Marxist, still Marxist, but area of thought. Post-apparist Marxism is also interested in the turning of life into capital, etc. Here on this topic, I think Preciado is a very good point to start from, because what I find interesting in the way, first of all, there is a kind of playful dimension in what she does. So that's which actually prevents it from being pompous, and also from precisely at some point you don't know what to make of it. But nonetheless, she presents her notion of what she calls the pharmacopornographic regime as an offspring, or as something that she thought in the wake of Foucault, and at the same time, it as something that precisely puts in question the old, Foucauldian paradigm of surveillance and discipline, which then would be replaced by something else, which is precisely not discipline anymore, but exactly what she describes and I quoted one moment when she says that these technologies of power are being incorporated in the body as the body, so that the power doesn't simply come upon the body from the outside or from above to discipline and crash it, but actually the body, including, and that's of course what is disquieting, there is, if you want, there is no outside of the workings of power, since they are embodied in even the most transgressive forms of embodiment. And so that's what Preciado, and Preciado is interesting because she at the same time theorizes that and indeed embodies it in its aporias. It is literally an aporia. There is no way out. If
Thank you, Anne.
Elizabeth?
So I have got to read this Preciado person, because this sounds absolutely fascinating. And so And so with this aporia, I'm back to my sort of pathetic question about how come all these critical thinkers are embracing capitalism rather than critiquing capitalism. It sounds as if she actually is performing a certain critique.
Yes. That's she or they, if you want, is performing a critique, and at the same time, giving us, and at the same time, within a theoretical frame that shows that the critique at the same time is self-defeating. There is, Preciado is certainly somebody, who takes the sides of all the oppressed, etc., and who is a vocal critique of capitalism, but at the same time, I would say, is a kind of martyr. She testifies, to what is being done, to our bodies and therefore our subjectivities in today's capitalism. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you.
So, since we know how exhausting Zooming is, oh no, Laura, scusa, yeah, go. But you have to unmute.
I'm sorry. And thank you, Anne. C'était magnifique. C'était génial. So I have just a little question, because I read Preciado since many years, and I love his work. I learned actually to call him, even if when I met, she was her, actually, Beatrice. So now my question is that of course, in Testo Junkie, the stake is this incorporation of this panopticon of Foucault. We govern ourselves by giving to us hormones. So we don't need anymore to be governed, because we govern ourselves. But there is no just this biomedicalization of sexuality in Preciado's thought. Because I think, for example, there is biology is one of the production of the technology of production of gender and sex. But there are many others. There are not in this biological turn. I lost you.
Yeah,
I lost you. Okay. So what do you think about what he writes about writing, for example? Writing, it's a technology of production of gender and sex. And what about, this is my question, what about name? Because the name is defined by Preciado as the strongest of this social technology. So this is not, I don't know, maybe there is something that has to do with the biological, but I don't think so. I don't think that writing or name, and in the last text of Preciado called Un appartement sur Uranus, which is a collective of little text written by Preciado in Libération. He talks about this importance. Maybe the name, it's the most important technology of production of genre sex.
Yeah. So in this sense, that would make Preciado into a kind, not so much of a neo-Foucauldian, but a kind of neo-Lacanian. If the name and the is indeed what genders us, which is to say the symbolic, etc. I think, you're right. I do not mean to, to reduce Preciado to one how do you say that, one line, of thought on these questions. Nonetheless, well, first of all, here I was working only with, I read the Preciado's, little chronicles in Libération. So, and, at the same time, I have to say that I thought that precisely everything you say is right, but we didn't need Preciado to think that. I would say that what Preciado brought to the conversation is precisely the question of the biomedical, the biopharmaceutic, and precisely what she calls, living under the pharmaco-pornographical regime.
No, of course. I'm just telling now, just to be clear, of course, this is an important, and Testo Junkie is around these topics, but this is just one among the possible technology of production of genre.
But one that has gained a certain, à la fois,
I know. French is a
certain epistemic and mediatic prominence, so the conjunction of the two is interesting. And then, I wondered, because Preciado chronicled in Libération, which is this French daily, more or less leftist, center-left daily, has chronicled her transition, etc. And for instance, I remember when in one of his chronicles, she describes the theoretical and of course subjective, but in political and complications of going to the doctor, to start a regular process of transition. And then, you wonder why, given everything she says in Testo Junkie, why, why necessarily take this? What's compelling him? What has compelled him to take this path? And in a way, the answers are in Testo Junkie. This is why I was saying that the position she adopts is that in the literal sense of the term, of the martyr to the biomedicalization of sexuality. If as you say, Laura, if the name, if the performative was enough, for instance, if it was enough to say, as she says in Testo Junkie, well, I haven't waited for the medical body.
Exactly.
If I am a man or not, If I say I'm a man, if I have a fantastic and phantasmatic construction worker's cock, then I do, And yet,
Yes.
she transitions.
Yeah, of course, but I'm wondering if, because I don't know how to say in English, la pratique dissidente of this taking. This is a pratique dissidente.
That's true.
So he's not just taking and beginning something already decided by the institution, by the state, but it's something which is the same material, but in a sort of counter.
In Testo Junkie, what she chronicles is a kind of wild, practice of transitioning, unregulated,
Exactly.
outside political control, etc. Yes, and so and therefore, potentially, upsetting in all registers. But then, what happened later, and what he chronicled in Libération, is how finally he decided to go and see a doctor and start a regular process of transitioning. Now, what you're saying is true, which is to say that, of course, trans bodies, trans bodies or trans subjects are, of course, have a kind of performative political force because they are, minority bodies, and because it is a kind of dissident practice. But a dissident practice, the dissidents today, this is what the Preciado shows, and we go back to the question of Nicolas, is not the dissidence of the outsider, because there is no, there
Yes,
is no
of course.
outside.
There is no outside. You write and you. But there is some effect that you could produce on this. Not outside. I don't know. And I think when he defines himself a non-trans,
Yeah.
A male trans, I don't know.
Yes, you're right. In other words, he's not saying I'm a man, I'm an
Exactly.
and therefore,
I fight against femininity and masculinity also.
Right.
So
And
this heterocentric dominant configuration of masculinity.
it's a way of saying that he wants and he doesn't want to pass, therefore he recalls. All this is absolutely true. And there is no question that, I would say that the more he impersonated, the transposition, the trans body, the more at the same time he made wider claims about the necessity of, trans to unite with migrants, etc. So all the, yes, so there is, again, and that's what makes him interesting, of course, is that it's not of one piece, it's not simple, but it's true that I took in Testo Junkie, which I think that, my reading of Testo Junkie is, en gros, I mean, basically nonetheless accurate, but and to me, I just wanted to I was interested, if you want, these are positions that are completely different. Malabou's, philosophical and political positions, Preciado's, probably Elizabeth Wilson, etc. So these are, they occupy different positions on the intellectual and political mat. But what interests me is where that intersects and the kind of questions that raises, at least for me.